and thanks for coming back for the second session, which will be on trade policy in a changing global environment. But just before we move on to that, just another housekeeping issue. We do have a mobile telephone that's been found and a parking voucher. So if either of those items or both of those belong to you, please go see Cheryl Brown at registration. So I'll introduce our next speaker, Sarah Wyant, who is President of the AgriPulse Communications. As a veteran farm policy reporter, Sarah is well recognised on Capitol Hill, as well as within the farm and community associations across America. Her newsletter and website, AgriPulse, includes the latest updates for on-farm policy, commodity and conservation program, trade, food safety, rural development, and environmental and regulatory programs. Sarah also publishes an early morning news summary called Daily Harvest, providing busy readers with a quick overview on the latest farm, food, and rural policy news. In 2015, Sarah was named in the annual Folio magazine in their section on entrepreneurs category as one of the top women in media. Sarah gained a first-hand knowledge of crop and livestock production whilst growing up on a farm near, my apology for not being able to pronounce this, in Iowa, and is still involved with her family's farming operation. She and husband Alan, parents of sons Jason and Jordan, also own the farm where her husband's family originally established a homestead near Almond, North Dakota. Sarah's keynote address is on the outlook for US and global agriculture policy post-Trump and other global political changes. Again, please interact, ask questions. Either we'll have roving microphones or use the availability of texting 0411 564 128. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks for inviting me, and Rosemary, and for all the organizers and the sponsors. I really appreciate the invitation to fly across the pond for 20 hours or so from our offices in Washington, D.C. and in central Missouri to talk to you about the environment for trade under the Trump administration. And I'd like to start with doing something that I don't normally do, but because I'm not as familiar with all of you as I would with the United States crowd, I want to have a little bit of a disclaimer. And that is because I am a journalist, and I am the founder of AgriPulse with a team of journalists in Washington, D.C. that, as Stephen mentioned, produce informational products. So every morning we are out with the Daily Harvest. Even before that, we have a piece that goes out called Daybreak. That's a perspective on what's happening on Capitol Hill. We do an in-depth newsletter that'll be going to subscribers actually early, when I get done with this presentation, it'll be heading out. And then we also update our website. So I am a journalist that is trained in trying to call them as we see them. I'm not here to be an apologist for the Trump administration. I'm not here to be someone who wants to represent them in ways or tell stories about them, do an impression of Donald Trump. I think your Australian Prime Minister has that down. So what I'm going to tell you is based on discussions with a lot of different folks. Many of our subscribers are within the Beltway. They represent American Farm Bureau, the nation's largest farm organization, National Grain and Feed, National Cattlemen's, National Pork Producers, National Farmers Union. All the major trade organizations that lobby on behalf of farmers and ranchers in the country that have lobbying groups in Washington, D.C. are some of our subscribers. But 77% of our audience is actually out in the countryside. And we make a big point of talking to them on a regular basis, not just my home state of Iowa or where my husband and I have a farm in North Dakota, but all around the country. And we also conduct nationwide research. So we do a lot to try to really keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in American agriculture. Now, having said that, and trying to make you understand, we are not fake news. We also are very cognizant of what others are saying and how they're portraying some of the changes in this administration. Some of it's just a little too good to pass up. This was a New York Post headline that ran just 4 days ago comparing the Trump administration to the TV series Survivor. And you can see through the caricatures who some of the key people are in this, including President Trump in the middle, and then, of course, Reince Priebus, who was chief of staff, and Anthony Scaramucci, who was communications director for almost 4 days before now being out. So, you know, things change quickly in Washington. You have to keep an eye on things all the time. The news cycle, when I started my career, enabled us to do a weekly. Now we're pretty much 24/7 trying to keep an eye on things, and partially because we know the president likes to tweet. And I don't see this stopping anytime soon. And his tweets are far-ranging. He goes from bashing Senator Murkowski from Alaska for her vote on health care reform, which, as you probably know now, is a dead issue for the time being in the United States, to announcing a ban on transgenders in the media, to then also going after his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, a senator who was early to back him and now is apparently on the outs. So I think the president is going to continue to tweet. He commands the news cycle that way. The only change I've seen since he has now named a new chief of staff, General Kelly, is that he has not bashed any individual personally in the last 24 hours. So he's been talking about the stock market hitting historic highs, and he's been talking about all the changes that he's making that are really good for the U.S. economy. So for a little while now, we've got a reprieve. Now, some of you may be asking, how in the world did this happen with the U.S. elections? I'm sure that you've seen a lot of the headlines, and you probably watched with a great degree of interest while we were having the primaries. I have to say that, and several times I thought that Donald Trump would not be the Republican nominee. There were different things that happened, different statements made, but then I'd go out into the countryside and people would tell me, we want something different. We do not want anything similar to what we had the last 8 years. They felt, and your shadow minister mentioned this earlier, they felt disenfranchised. They felt left out. They felt that their economic opportunities had been capped, and they really wanted something different. And I can tell you, whether they were Republicans or Democrats in farm country, some of the Democrats that voted for Donald Trump did not think that Hillary Clinton was different enough. They thought she would be more of the same. And when her chief rival on the Democratic side, who was Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, said he wanted to get out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, she changed her position to wanting to get out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. But a lot of the Democrats I talked to said, we think she's going to change back to what she was under the Obama administration as Secretary of State, and that she will reverse her position. So the protectionism that was bubbling up on the Democratic side, and also from some in the Republican side, really surfaced to elevate Donald Trump, not only through the primary, but onto the general election. And so I think it's important to understand that he was tapping into a base of voters that felt he was listening to them for the first time, that he was a businessman, not a politician, and that he was going to be different. Well, he certainly is. He's very different. And so we spent a lot of time trying to interpret what does that mean for agriculture and more broadly for trade policy. Well, one thing we do know is that the people who elected him were in what a lot of people on both coasts call flyover country. It's not the New York, Washington, D.C., East Coast liberal branch. It's not the San Francisco, LA, West Coast. It's Iowa, Wisconsin. His ability to flip traditionally blue states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio. So even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, he was able to play the Electoral College in a way that led to his win. And this map, or versions of this, have been very critical in convincing the president on trade policy issues. Because when he gets into a position where he says, well, let's scrap the Trans-Pacific Partnership, people say, okay, but let's think about what does that mean to the farmers and ranchers. The same on NAFTA, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The North American Free Trade Agreement, he apparently was on the very edge of throwing that all the way out the door. But some of his advisors brought in a map to show who was going to be hurt by a decision like that to totally withdraw. So we're going into renegotiation. So on the campaign trail, then candidate Trump did not do a lot to offer specifics. The ones he did offer were very broad brush promises, and if you ever went to a campaign rally, people could chant these out like, you know, they were their long-held beliefs. He was going to build the wall, secure the border. He wanted to temporarily ban refugees, bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Again, he's speaking to that base of voters who felt they were disenfranchised by a previous administration. We already talked about withdrawing from TPP and renegotiating NAFTA, repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, a key campaign promise which now has just looked like it's stalled in our Congress, and I can't see it coming back anytime soon. Cut taxes, make it better for the middle class, cut regulations, downsize the federal government, drain the swamp of lobbyists, many of whom are advising still in this administration. But the one thing that he said repeatedly in farm country, despite having a lot of his advisors being affiliated with the oil industry, is that he was going to maintain the renewable fuel standard. So that's why I wanted to point this out, especially from our previous discussion. This was the only ag policy position outside of trade that he was clear as can be. Why would that be? Well, he wanted Iowa Governor Terry Branstad and his son, Eric, who was running his campaign in Iowa, to flip that state back to Republican for Trump. And they did. He also wanted to make sure that farmers and ranchers who were his core advisory committee, who supported the RFS, knew that he had their back. So one thing, if you're not familiar, during the first run for presidency, Barack Obama had an agricultural advisory committee, and it was made up of farmers and ranchers and lobbyists and ex-government officials, and they kept him focused on a rural vote. Not in his re-election so much, but he had an advisory committee. Trump had an advisory committee on steroids. It was a who's who of American agriculture that had any affiliation with the Republican Party. And so they were always talking about things he needed to do, people that he needed to pick for his top nominees. And so they were very influential throughout the campaign. And now that he's been elected, they still carry quite a bit of sway. Now we understand that U.S. farmers are less than 2% of the United States population. But every time one of these farm leaders gets up to talk, they remind him and they remind his administration that they helped him get elected, farmers and rural voters collectively. So this is some of the things that he said during the campaign. What has he actually done? Well, let's be honest. He issued a series of executive orders early on, and they sounded quite good. It sounded like he could do something, right? He was going to be very active. He's got this business acumen. He's going to get out there and he's going to do something right away, keep his campaign promises. So he's going to build a wall and secure the border, and the refugee ban, of course, you know that's tied up in the courts now. He's gotten some wins out of that and a lot more losses and a lot of confusion. Manufacturing jobs, he's been touting that. And as we've mentioned, he hasn't been able to cut the Affordable Care Act or taxes quite yet. But he issued these orders that said he was going to do certain things and kind of move the ball forward. But of course, in the United States, we have 3 branches of government. He is the head of the executive branch. Okay, got it. But he also needs to have the legislative branch take action on things like health care and tax reform, and the judicial branch, which is going to have to interpret some of these court challenges and make rulings on whether or not they will stand or not. So promises made, but not necessarily promises kept yet. So I guess you have to say, you know, on a scorecard of things that he has done, especially for American agriculture, he's created some uncertainty. The action to withdraw from TPP has made people very, very nervous. American agriculture was largely in support of the changes that were going to be made. He says no more multilaterals, you know, we'll renegotiate NAFTA, but we want only bilaterals, and we want to rethink some of the existing trade agreements in addition to NAFTA, the South Korean FTA, and others. I mentioned it was really a last-minute thing before he decided to renegotiate, not withdraw from NAFTA, and that's because he had a couple people in at the last minute, a clutch meeting to change his mind. The direction to secure the border and enhance security, that has created a lot of confusion out in farm country, because some of the immigrants, you know, we get their papers, they go into dairies and they go into feedlots and they say, here's my papers, they're legal, everything's fine. Farmers don't have a lot of ways to check whether those are 100% legal. But after Trump started cracking down on illegal immigrants, bumping up border security, some of these people just went home. I've talked to dairymen who said, I went to work one day and some of my employees said, I just don't want to risk it anymore, I'm going to leave. I've talked to landscapers who used to have a great supply of Hispanic labor. They couldn't find them this summer. So the labor force and the uncertainty for a lot of farmers and ranchers has added to their angst about what's going on in the administration. And I have to say that there's a lot of appreciation for what he could do on infrastructure. But again, we've got a Congress and we've got folks who are saying, where's the money going to come from? Are we going to do private-public partnerships and have this outside investment? You know, how's that going to work? So he has not advanced infrastructure either. And then, of course, I don't have to tell any of you, when you look at the tweets, when you look at some of the statements, the chaos that has engulfed the staff at the White House has really detoured from his agenda. So it's made it more difficult for people to really say, okay, this president is delivering to this point. But then again, you go out and you talk to farmers and ranchers. What do you think? Are you still with them? I mean, we did a nationwide survey during the primary, during the general election. All of that showed that people were willing to support Trump. We've got a new one that's out in the field right now. I'll have the results in a couple of weeks. And I'll be shocked if the support for him has really declined dramatically. I had a woman in our office from Minnesota last week who said, you know, Sarah, every day is Christmas since we elected President Trump. I said, really? How so? And she just said, I feel like a burden has been lifted off of our back. So I'm going to go through five of the key reasons that I hear most from farmers and ranchers about why they support this administration, to just give you a feel for where they're coming from. One of the first ones is regulatory reform. There is a general sense that there had been a burden on their back in terms of red tape and regulations that were making it more difficult for farmers just to farm. We call these freedom to operate issues in the United States, and there was a real interest in, you know, we want to be stewards of the land, we want to raise our families, we want to bring the next generation up in agriculture, just let us do our job. And one of the rallying cries for the Trump administration was to get rid of what's called the Waters of the U.S. rule. WOTUS is the acronym that people use. And when Trump came into office, he issued this executive order that said, if you're going to do any new regulations, you're going to have to take 2 back. And he's got people working on that. But he said from the very start, one of the things we want to do is repeal WOTUS. And what this rule did was it defined what was considered a navigable water on farmlands. And it expanded it significantly from what had been what you would think, a navigable water, boats can go on it, that sort of thing, to smaller areas that were small little streams and ditches. And so the agricultural community writ large pretty much said, we've got to get rid of this rule. And in an interview with the Wall Street Journal this week, when asked about his most significant accomplishments yet to date, the president said, I've made it possible for people to be able to control their land and to farm their farms, in reference to getting rid of WOTUS. So this is an issue that really won a lot of support for him. And I have to say, it wasn't just Republicans, it was Democrats. When we researched it and did our nationwide poll, it was younger farmers, older farmers, small farmers, large farmers. They felt that they needed more freedom to operate. So this regulatory reform talking point for the president is a home run in farm country. One of the other things that probably isn't talked about enough is that his pick for the Supreme Court is seen as a barrier to a lot of the challenges that have been coming up from the environmental community and from those groups that farmers feel very anxious about. Judge Neil Gorsuch, as you may know, his mother was a former administrator of the EPA in a previous Republican administration. He is viewed as a constitutionalist who wants to interpret the law as it's originally been written and intended under the Constitution. And he's viewed as a very important member of the Supreme Court that will uphold some of these challenges that have been coming up through agencies. And I'm sure this happens in your country and others, but what had been happening increasingly in the United States is that an agency like USDA, the Department of Agriculture, or our Environmental Protection Agency would issue a rule, and then it would be challenged by some groups who said, oh no, we can't have those kinds of pesticides being applied on farms and ranches. It's too dangerous. And instead of the EPA coming back and saying, oh, well, we've got science on our side, we think we're good, we're going to still do this, the challenge would come up through the courts, and oftentimes the agency would back off. So having the ability to appoint not only the Supreme Court justice, and I don't think this will be his last one, but federal judges, and to stack the courts up with people who are more friendly to the business community is seen as a big win for the administration. Another thing is that he's got a handful of advisors. I can't tell you how many people are really running these agencies right now. It's not very many. We have a Secretary of Agriculture confirmed. We don't have a Deputy Secretary. We don't have any undersecretaries. You know, the cabinet is full now, but it took a lot longer than for other administrations. But the president does have a special advisor on agriculture. His name's Ray Starling. He's pictured here in this slide. And I have to say that when you see what Starling has done, he reports to National Economic Advisor Gary Cohn. And when you see Sonny Perdue and you see Wilbur Ross at Commerce and you see some of these people talking, you get the vibe that it's a much more entrepreneurial, quick-working administration than you've seen in the past. And I'm saying that over both Republican and some Democratic administrations. It's not really about the policies, it's just it's this ability to move things quickly. And this is just one example. We have a National Agriculture Day, and you know, it's a day to step back and celebrate. It's the first day of spring. And you know, for a lot of administrations, we have in agriculture said, boy, it'd be nice if the president would once say the word farm, if he'd say the word agriculture, if he'd mention a rancher here and there, maybe State of the Union, something like that. And it usually doesn't happen. But here you've got the new team coming in, you've got this special advisor, and he says, yeah, you know, we haven't had one of these proclamations since Bill Clinton in 1993. So in 2 weeks, he goes to work to see if he can get this drafted, and I talked to him like the day before he was going to finalize it, and he said, I think we're close. I think we're really close. We're on Air Force One right now, and we're finalizing the language. You know, that just hasn't happened for the agriculture community for a long time. To have some administration really talk the talk, or as Ray says, brag on ag. Now, it has to be followed through with substance. We know that. We have to have actions. But the talking points are very loud and clear that this administration understands and wants to support agriculture. They've got this task force on rural prosperity. I think this is a number 4 reason why farmers are saying, okay, they're going to sit down there and collectively, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Transportation, Commerce, head of the Federal Communications Committee, Ray Starling, Health and Human Services, they're all sitting down. This is a cafeteria in USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and they're talking about how can we make it better, more business-friendly in agriculture in the United States. And their report's due here in October, so we'll see what they can come up with. Again, the words have to be followed by actions, but for right now, farmers and ranchers are tending to give them the benefit of the doubt to see what this new team can come up with. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what the Trump administration has already done for China. And I'll explain a couple of photos here. These were actually taken not too far from where I grew up. I was able to go with the Trump team when they landed in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, for 3 events. The first one was to highlight technical training, 2-year training on how to drive a combine and technical skills in agriculture at Kirkwood Community College. The next one was a standing room only event for agricultural leaders, and the last one was an event, a campaign-style rally in downtown Cedar Rapids. So here's President Trump. He gets off the plane with the former governor of Iowa, Terry Branstad, who's shown in that top photo with President Trump. Now, Governor Branstad was a friend of the Chinese President Xi Jinping from really some of his early trips to Iowa back to 1985. So we think that this is a key appointment, having the governor as ambassador in China. And it's also very apparent that the first meeting that Trump and Xi had seemed to go off fairly well. They met at Mar-a-Lago in Florida. They had launched a 100-day plan. And since that time, we've seen access to U.S. beef in China, U.S. rice in China, and approval of some, not all pending biotech traits, but some. So it's viewed as a major victory in farm and ranch country that these doors have been opened to China. Now, what's going to happen if North Korea continues to take aim at the United States with their missiles? I don't know. The president has tried to apply pressure on China in order to put pressure on North Korea. Apparently, there's consideration of sanctions going on yet this week. I wish I knew the answer to that, and I wish it did not involve military action, but there could be some decisions made that make this whole situation and environment, the early love between the U.S. and the Chinese, not be as strong. But I did talk to a bunch of Iowans, our Secretary of Agriculture, our new governor, a bunch of farm leaders just came back from there. They are more bullish than ever before on the ability to do more trade with China. But farmers aren't all happy campers. You know what's happening with commodity prices. And we've got net farm income headed in the wrong direction, down to $62.3 billion. It's about a 9% drop. There's that nervousness that, you know, a few years ago, they were making a lot of money. Farmland prices were going like this. Cash rent prices were going like this. Incomes were going like this. And now the trend is the other direction. So there's a big concern out there that if we don't get these trade deals moving forward, and if we don't keep the feet under the fire of the administration, that other countries like Australia, like some of the other folks that are able to fill that void, whether Ukraine or South America, will step in. And so that does have the farmers and ranchers a little bit on a nervous edge here as they look at how to judge the administration. And of course, some of your previous speakers have already talked about this. We've got a lot of drought in the northern plains. The moisture has not been what it seemed to be. I got a picture from my sister-in-law yesterday. All the yards in North Dakota, all of the pastures are dried up. We've got friends in Montana and western North Dakota where there's been fires, rangeland, hundreds of thousands of acres have burned. And then on the other extreme, in the eastern Corn Belt, there's been too much water, standing in fields and cornfields right now. So there's a lot of uncertainty, as there always is, of course, over the extremes with the weather. And then the key test, of course, right now for farmers, ranchers, as they try to judge the Trump administration going forward is, what will you do with the North American Free Trade Agreement? And I have to say that the early going on this, after it was decided to renegotiate instead of withdraw, was that the farm groups got their act together and negotiated with the Trump administration on really what they wanted. First was do no harm. We really like our access, for the most part, with Canada and Mexico. They're consistently 2, 3, or 4 as our top trading partners. Secretary Perdue went to Mexico last week to meet with his counterpart in Mexico. He came back saying everything's fine. They realize that they have a great relationship with the U.S. I really don't think they were doing anything but negotiating when they said they were going to start buying from the South Americans. That's not what our U.S. Grains Council says. Our Grains Council says they are going to start buying in August and September. So we're going to find out whether the Mexicans are going to be a little tougher negotiators than Secretary Perdue thought at first or not. But we'll also see negotiations begin in earnest on August 16th, and time will tell how we come out with this. But let's face it, the U.S. trade representative already knew what Mexico and Canada were willing to give under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? So if we can just improve the agreement by embracing those changes that they were willing to give, and then of course there's a strong interest by our dairy sector, our poultry sector, and some of our fruit and vegetable growers to make some additional changes. But if we can make some of those without doing harm to the agricultural sector, I think this will be viewed as a victory. But of course, time is also of the essence, and that was the main message, I think, from a House Agricultural Committee meeting last week that basically had a score of different commodity groups in the U.S. saying, hurry up, get this done, get it fixed. We want to be back to selling more product. The numbers aren't lying about the fact that we are seeing some improvements. Our USDA says agricultural exports in total, all exports, not just feed and grains, at 137 billion, up $1 billion from what was forecast in February. We'd like to see that number go higher, of course, but grain and feed exports are at 29 billion, up 400 million. Cotton exports, 400 million to 5.4 billion. And oilseed and product exports at 31.7 billion, up 100 million, and I think that's going to continue to increase from the people that I've been talking to. And you can see from this little chart how important trade is depending on the different commodities that we export, whether 70% of cotton, 70% of tree nuts, 50% of our soybeans, 50% of wheat, rice, and sorghum, on average equivalent to 20% of net farm income. Farmers know that trade is important and they want to enhance it. And our congressmen know that trade is important, and during the last Farm Bill, they decided that USDA should be reorganized to appoint a new undersecretary, one of the top reporters, candidates reporting to the secretary, and this person would be focused solely on trade. The nominee has been named. It's Ted McKinney. He's been the Director of Agriculture in Indiana, and he'll be a strong advocate for trade if he can get through the Senate confirmation process. He won't have much opposition, but our Senate is about ready to go out on recess, and so some of these nominees could not possibly be considered until September at the rate that they're going now. So I want to leave you with just a couple of parting thoughts, because I'm so eager to hear the rest of the speakers at this conference. And from my perspective, I'm talking about the government's role. But I think there are a lot of things going on in the marketplace that I find very, very interesting in how those vectors are going to shape the future of agricultural policy. I think we've seen a lot of disruption. I know we have in the communications field. You know, I started my career typing on a typewriter and using carbon paper to have the duplicate. And now I can take out my iPhone and edit and write stories and send them around the world. We've seen similar disruption in a lot of different technologies, and then we've seen consolidation. You've got ChemChina buying Syngenta in Switzerland, Dow and DuPont to US-based companies, Bayer and Monsanto. This picture here is of President Ren, president of ChemChina. I had a chance to meet him in Switzerland last month, and very impressive man. And I can't help but believe that he is going to continue to boost the technology play in China, whether it's the embracement of more biotech traits or the enhancement of more data-driven agriculture. I think he seemed like really on the cutting edge of what he wanted to do in that country. And then on the consumer end, you're also seeing things like Amazon buying Whole Foods. What a disruptor for our grocery industry. You've got the big brands like Kroger and Safeway and others saying, wow, what's going to happen if these millennials who have a lot of disposable income in our country just order it up on Amazon and a drone delivers their food and they stop going to retail? It's already happening in a lot of the big department stores. You go to a mall in the United States right now, good luck finding many people. They're ordering online. So is this the future of our food system, where we're going to be connecting a grower to an online provider and to some sort of a drone delivery system? Are we going to see more consumer interest? We've already seen quite a bit, but more consumer interest in branded products, even branded commodities, and data and transparency? I was in Italy a couple weeks ago and visited an agritourism operation, and he bottled a couple 100,000 bottles of wine. And he had a QR code on the back of his wine bottle where you could just zoom in with your iPhone and you could find out all about his family and his winery. And I noticed the same thing in my wine bottle in my hotel room here, where people connect using technology to connect growers with consumers. We're seeing a lot of interest in data and transparency and sustainability among our farmers and ranchers, but I'm wondering if we're thinking big enough. Are we investing in the R&D? Are we investing in the supply systems? Are we talking to that next generation about what we need to do to revitalize agriculture, not just in America, but around the globe? So I'd just like to leave that with you as a parting thought and look forward to talking to you and listening to our other presenters over the rest of the conference. So thank you very much. I got it.
Thanks, Sarah. Are there any questions that we have for Sarah from the audience? Pat, do we have a microphone? If you could please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Sarah. I had the privilege of going through those flyover states just a few weeks ago and driving through them, not flying over them. And I concur with what you put up there. Jerem Critch is my name. I think one of the issues we have with you talking about the millennials and trying to communicate with the consumer is a lot of the time they don't look at facts and science unless it supports their argument. in Australia, for example, at the moment, South Australia can't use GM canola, even though all the science says that it's 100% safe. And then the consumer will look at climate change and say, yep, we agree with science. So they just pick and choose what science they want to agree with. How do we handle that? How do we deal with that?
I would say that your concerns mirror much of the United States. And in fact, in the U.S. Congress, we have people who say, you know, we have to deal with climate science. We're seeing climate change. How can you be a climate denier? And then on the other hand, you'll have people say, well, we have biotechnology that can solve a lot of your climate issues. We can be more sustainable. We can, you know, so the science seems to be in the eye of the beholder for a lot of people. I would certainly agree with you on that. But I do think that there are generational issues that can be overcome with greater transparency and discussion. I have two sons. One is a pure millennial. And, you know, we've had a lot of discussions with he and his friends about, well, where did you hear that? And you know, you're entitled to read whatever you want, but let's be thinking about, do you trust that source? And is it something that you think that is going to stand alone as a fact after you've researched this? And I've been very pleased to see, by having some of these discussions and opening up, you know, farms and access to more information, that we've been able to change some minds and to find some more middle ground on actually what is a, you know, a sound piece of science. So I do think it's possible, but I think it requires a lot of communication and education on both sides, and people willing to not be so set in their ways that they're not open to that there might be yet a third way, a second or third way.
Pat, yeah, sorry, just the middle. Pat.
Hi, thanks, Sarah. Kate Burke from Think Agri's who I am. My question to you is, if there was one difference to describe the impact of the way the Obama administration ran agriculture compared to the way the Trump administration is running agriculture, could you describe the major difference, I guess, and the impact that does have on the people in, say, North Dakota and Iowa?
Oh, and probably not a short answer, but I would say that the Obama administration had a lot of very talented people as well. Darcy Vetter, the U.S. trade negotiator, Tom Vilsack, our Secretary of Agriculture. But there was a frustration, I think, even from some of them that, you know, there was not an ability to move the ball perhaps as far as they would have liked, to open up new trade avenues, and to, and that's not necessarily the president's fault. It has to deal with a lot of other factors, but you know, they were supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think they would have liked to move quicker and just get it done before the Trump team came in, but they couldn't because there was a reluctance among several people in the party to go forward with that and make it even tougher for Secretary Clinton to advance. So that would be one thing that was different. The other is, of course, the administrator of the EPA became kind of a target, a whipping girl, so to speak, for the agricultural community because of the positions on WOTUS and the position on many crop chemicals. And so that was not viewed favorably. But there were a lot of things that the administration, as I said, they really had some good people trying to advance and expand markets, but perhaps not as the speed and the coordination that we've seen in the early attempts from the Trump administration. Whether they'll be able to continue at that pace, I don't know. But I did think it was interesting when I'm sitting there watching people get off Air Force One, and you've got national security, you've got commerce, you've got Purdue, you've got an ag advisor, and they're all with Trump, with Branstad, and they all go back on the plane, and they're all still meeting throughout the night on their way back to Washington, and you know, they're really impatient.
I think we've time for one more question.
Just Angus Thornton from Pro Farm Australia. Look, I think one thing that has been agreed upon in the aftermath of Trump's election is that it was a reflection of increasing polarisation amongst the electorate, in which personality and image was probably more important than ever. So given that Trump was described as an outsider candidate who won effectively against the odds, do you think this sets a precedent that, at least for the short to medium term, nominees for president and other positions of office from both sides of the aisle will increasingly come from these sort of outside lanes, rely on developing a sort of a personality cult? Or do you think this will act as something of a circuit breaker to get the establishment wings of the party to sort of get their act together and either tap into the sentiment that saw Trump elected, or do you think they'll be able to sort of work to defeat that and get people back and buying into the establishment messages that they're sending?
Oh golly, I guess maybe you could ask people in Minnesota who once elected Jesse Ventura that sometimes electing an outsider isn't always the way you want to go, but you can't deny that this is what happened with the voters, and they wanted an outsider. And I think a key point I will be watching is to see what happens in our midterm elections. And so, every 2 years we elect every member of the House, and every 6 years a member of our Senate is up. And there are a lot of very nervous Republicans right now who think that they either need to really buck up against Trump or they need to be in line with Trump. And some of them who aren't in line with Trump are going to be primaried. They're going to be challenged by members of their own party. And so if the Republicans who now control the House, the Senate, and the White House can't maintain their majority in the midterms, I think there's going to be a dramatic rethinking of all of the Republicans. Having said that, the Democrats have just announced a new game plan called A Better Way, where they have insisted that they are now going to relate to mainstream workers and those who had felt disenfranchised and were perhaps more attracted to the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. And so they're out with a big, trying to get mainstream candidates on their side as well. So I really just think it's too early to tell whether this is going to, be a totally that we're going to go to all outsiders, or we're going to spring back and go to more mainstream candidates, because we just really have to see what happens with the party going into the midterms.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much.